to APRIGF 2024, Digital Censoring Tools and Democracy from 1:30 to 10:40 to 2:40. All sessions are being recorded and transcribed for records and will be made publicly available. All participants are reminded to follow the code of conduct. The agenda is about to begin. Please allow me to invite the host to lead us through the upcoming session.
Hi. I hope we can begin now.
Yes, we can, Haroon.
Yeah. So, greetings from SFLC.in. I am Syed Mohammad Haroon, fellow at SFLC.in. I majorly manage India's Internet Shutdowns tracker, which is internetshutdowns.in. A brief about who we are. So, SFLC.in is a donor-supported legal services organization that brings together lawyers, policy analysts, and students to protect the freedom in digital world. We try to promote innovation and open access to knowledge by helping developers make free and open source softwares, protect the privacy and civil liberties for the citizens in the digital world. We try in our project, we try to educate and provide free legal services and advice to help policy making and make informed decisions and use and adoption of technology. Among many other things, as I noted, our marquee projects include the Internet Shutdowns Tracker that tracks any internet shutdown which is happening throughout India. And we also have recently launched our Free Speech Tracker, which tracks the violation of any free speech rights throughout India. And beginning with the panel and giving an introduction to the panel, for the panel, I'd like to quote David Kane from the UN Special Rapporteur for the Freedom of Expression, who very aptly observed that a general network shutdown is in clear violation of international law and cannot be justified. Yet, with these Asia-Pacific countries, we have seen that the governments have been using these tools to stifle dissent, freedom of speech and expression, and cover up atrocities. Unfortunately, in the past few decades, the Asia-Pacific region has emerged as the hotspot of these digital crackdowns. And according to a report by Access Now, in the past year, that is 2023, 39 countries have interrupted the internet 283 times alone, and that number is rising sharply with nearly half the year passing. We have already seen around 36 internet shutdown in India itself. And coming to the topic of India, we have seen that it has been on the forefront of internet shutdowns, where such tactic has not only stifled free speech, but also have severe economic repercussions and costing billions of dollars in revenue and investment. Beyond India, we have seen examples of internet being shut down in several other countries of Asia-Pacific regions, such as Bangladesh, Pakistan, Myanmar, and many others, which have been used to suppress protests, silence, target vulnerable groups, and marginalized communities. Today, we'll delve deeper into the causes, consequences, and implications of digital censoring tools in the Asia-Pacific region vis-a-vis democratic processes. And we'll hear from the experts who have been following this issue and who have a very strong hold on the aspects and the tactics that the government and the state have been following through these tools. And with that, I welcome my esteemed panelists. I'd start with Jenna Fung, who's the Program Director of Net Missions Asia, Jean Sahel, who's the Asia Pacific Head of Content Policy and the Global Head of Telecommunications Policy for Google. Usama Khilji, who's the Director of Bolopi, a digital rights platform in Pakistan, and Mr. Gyan Prakash Tripathi, who has been a volunteer at SFLC.in and is an advocate and public policy researcher. With that short introduction and with the understanding the paucity of time, I'd like to begin the first round of questions, which deals with the threat and impact of censoring tools. And I'd like to begin with Jenna, and I'd direct this question that how do you think that the content blocking and internet shutdowns stifle political discourse and digital inclusion during elections, and particularly for young people?
Thank you for having me on this panel. And I was like hoping, please don't let me speak first, because I love hearing what other people say and then pick up on that. But in any case, I think to begin with, I can start off by giving the youth perspective, also maybe touching on some of my personal experience, because I come from Hong Kong, somehow unfortunately experienced some of the experience with how internet enables some of the civic engagement that was happening in the past years. I think to start with, and I would try to keep it brief because I hope this can be a conversation among the panels. I believe the fundamental things about internet and internet shutdown, to be specific, is that this is, this is what internet enables us to mobilize people nowadays, especially within the younger generations. And then when sort of like people in power just shut it down, I think this is a really savage act, because that's basically cut off the way where this generation would communicate. I think you could tell from the recent protests in Bangladesh. Myself personally experienced that in Hong Kong. They don't necessarily like cut you off completely, but slow down all the internet speeds, or you can't access certain website. That's another way of shutting the flow of information. I think behind the underlying intention of this action is to cut off the information flow, because that's how people mobilize. I don't want to further elaborate on this yet, and I will stop here because I would love to hear from other panelists, and later to pick up on some of the questions or comments from the audience as well, in order to enrich our conversation here. So yeah, I'll stop here.
Thanks, Jenna, for the introductory remarks. There's a very important aspect to it. So whenever there's an internet shutdown, obviously there are policies, intermediaries who are working on making sure that the information is provided to every citizen, and they play an important role in ensuring that there's no misinformation, disinformation, and the real news gets out. So this question obviously goes to Google, and that is John. And I'd like to ask from Google's perspective, how do these censoring tools impact the access to information and exacerbate the digital divide? And what can tech policy companies such as Google play in mitigating government censorship efforts in the Asia Pacific region? And what could be a way around it, perhaps?
Thank you, Haroon, and SFLC for organizing this, and nice to be with everyone today on this important topic that sadly we've had to deal with for some years already now, and arguably it's getting worse. And perhaps what I can usefully do in my introductory remarks is touch on how regulation has been misused and is being misused as effectively a tool for censoring of the internet in some parts of the world and of our region. As we all know and appreciate, especially in a setting like this at the IGF, the internet has brought huge opportunities across the board, social and economic, access to information, access to knowledge, dramatically lower the barriers for everyone anywhere to create, to distribute, and to find information, let voices express themselves that before weren't so able to do so, and enabling innovation and all sorts of economic activity as well. But of course, we're conscious that at the same time, like all means of communications before it, the internet can be used for both the best and the worst of purposes, right, or misused. So that's why limiting the spread of hateful and violent extremist content, for instance, has been a major focus, and we have a number of policies, of tools and processes that disallow hateful content, for example. But we should always keep in mind that our platforms are used for free expression, for access to information, and therefore that we need to be balanced and nuanced in our approach. For instance, content that is offensive or shocking can still be valid. It is important to ensure that we're not over-blocking permissible content. And that's where the real risks lie for human rights, and particularly for free expression. As much as, I think, as societies, we want, and digital platforms ourselves, we want to remove violative, harmful content as quickly as possible, we have to ensure that the decisions to do so are taken, reached with care. And it's important to then look at what's happening out there, and both at national level and at regional level. We've already raised in previous editions of the APRGF, for instance, concerns that there are regulations that have been enacted or that are being proposed where basically the end result would actually impact human rights negatively. So we're talking about online safety regulations that are deemed to be helping users and making them safe, but that actually might have unintended or intended consequences of censorship or aiding censorship in some cases. And the problem is that this trend is really intensifying. So let's go back a few years. Recently we had the COVID pandemic, and we all witnessed how the internet became ever so important to continue our economic and our social lives. But the emergency measures and legislations that were introduced at the time of COVID very often included subtle clauses relating to things like misinformation, for instance. And sure, we had to deal with things like health misinformation during COVID, but effectively, those clauses have been misused in some cases, not to help curb mis and disinformation, but actually to quash freedom of expression. Or at least there was the risk of that in a number of places. And then some of these emergency measures are not just emergency measures anymore, they're still around, or they've evolved into longer-term regulations. And we see a trend that shows an increasing amount of regulations that targets digital companies with regulatory requirements that effectively lead to the over-removal, effectively censorship of legitimate content, including political speech. Because of the threat of harsh sanctions in particular, the risk is that the authorities in certain countries attempt to force digital platforms through new legislation to take a better safe than sorry approach, implementing take down first, ask questions later approach to online content safety. So sort of about four points. Digital platforms regularly and increasingly receive overly broad removal requests that might go beyond the scope of the law, the products that they're dealing with. In fact, that's from not just government agencies, but also users. And there's been research of cease and desist and takedown letters that have found that many seek to remove potentially legitimate or protected speech. It's not just about dealing with genuinely bad content to help users. Also, second, governments are imposing ever shorter timescales for removing online content, down to just 4 hours in some cases in our region. What that means is that it leaves very little time, if any, to conduct a proper analysis, especially for human rights and public interest. Third, strict rules may also oblige internet companies to provide extensive assistance to law enforcement, including requirements around traceability of users and extensive retention of data. You might have heard in some of the panels this week that this sort of practice of providing ever more user data is being considered in legislative proposals right now in our region. It's becoming quite common. And the practical implementation of these combined obligations means that internet companies' ability to conduct appropriate due process assessments and push back on those unreasonable legal requests is severely constrained. And the threat of imposing severe sanctions, which range from heavy fines, which is something that's been proposed here, for instance, in Taiwan, or blocking access to an entire platform, we might hear about that from some real-life examples, all the way to introducing personal criminal liability for employees of the platforms, has the consequence of encouraging online platforms to conduct little or no review of requests, to just overblock because the risks are too harsh otherwise. And in the wrong environment, that's a sure way of putting in place a censorship regime by default, with the risk for freedom of expression that we can all see. And the only way to avoid these sanctions for technology companies would be not to invest in those countries, or to and to offer not to offer those services in those countries, but then or to only offer a subset of those services. And of course, what that means is that then it deprives local citizens and local businesses from all these online tools, the diversity of information you can get online, etc. So it's not a great thing either. So in this context, you know, these encroachments upon what should be normal online safety regulation, the erosion of the limitations of liability for internet intermediaries in Asia and the Pacific are particularly worrisome. So just trying to get to a conclusion, and maybe I'll expand later on when we have a dialogue. I think as a multi-stakeholder community, both well-meaning governments and all of us across the stakeholder community should really take concrete and forceful action to encourage, to stem the proliferation of these regulatory trends that negatively impact human rights and freedom of speech in Asia. That includes ensuring that the limitations of intermediary liability, internet intermediary liability, known as safe harbor, are maintained, that they're not diluted, so that internet companies can continue to abide by their commitments to human rights and the UN principles for business and human rights, and that they're not unduly forced to take down content by governments without due process. I think just starting at home, I think democratic governments and stakeholders should champion the adoption of good digital regulatory frameworks that do have the right safeguards, the right checks and balances, and ensure unfettered access to information on the internet for all. Maybe just to be very clear here, we're not just talking about governments and us as stakeholders talking down to other governments. It starts at home. It means that when we have regulations in democratic governments, they need to lead by example and not over-regulate, not put in place, as we have seen again in some countries in this region that are supposed to be of a strong democratic tradition, regulatory protections in place that effectively means that the regulator in that country can censor what's on a platform, not just at home, but also internationally, right? Because then that's the door to global censorship by anyone and everyone, everywhere, and a diminution of our freedoms everywhere. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jenna. So you actually gave a lot of perspective on how tech companies such as Google are, I mean, there is a safe harbor protocol, and you have a lot of self-censoring, and it's a huge balancing act. And honestly, there is nothing we can do when there is a complete blockade of internet shutdown. So, and that brings me to the recent example of what happened in Bangladesh, where there was a blanket internet shutdown. And we have seen the similar case during the democratic processes in Pakistan, even, where the internet shutdowns, internet services were shut a day before the elections, and there were also throttling of internet when the opposition parties started their rallies. So, which brings me to my next panelist, Mr. Usama, and the question directed is a more of a nuanced and experienced question, which is on what lessons can be learned from Pakistan's recent election-related internet shutdowns, and how can these lessons be applied to prevent similar actions being taken in other countries such as Bangladesh, because they also had nationwide a major news outlet being blocked on the day of the internet, on the day of the election, and of course the recent internet shutdown. So, what are the practical lessons we can use, and then once we come to the solutions, we'll come to the solutions.
Thank you very much, Haroon, for inviting me and for doing such a great job in organizing the panel. We had so much detail in advance, always. And also thankful for the APR IGF for doing such a great job at hosting us. So coming to the election in Pakistan, what we've seen is in the run up to the election, there was a lot of censorship, especially of opposition political parties. So for example, we saw that the website of a political party was blocked in advance of the election. And a lot of attempts were made to discourage people from voting from them, and they were quite blatant. But then on the day of the election in the morning, voting starts at around 8 a.m., and that's exactly when the entire network was shut down. So you couldn't even send a text message or make a phone call, let alone access the internet. And that lasted for up to 24 hours. So the entire election took place in a blackout. And what that meant was that instances of manipulation, of rigging, and as we call it, engineering, they all could not be broadcasted. Evidence could not be shared, and a lot of voters could not even access the location of their polling booths on Google Maps, for example, because the internet's not working. What you could also not do is hail a ride on a ride-hailing app because the internet was not working. So there are multiple impacts of how the network shutdown impacts citizens, especially on the day of an election. So there are a lot of lessons to learn, but I think at the end of the day, it all comes down to an utter lack of transparency from state authorities. And that seems to be the main issue. What we also saw was a week after the election, X, formerly Twitter, was blocked, and it remains blocked in Pakistan till this day. And again, a lack of transparency. So I think it has to do with the larger issues with democratic governance in emerging democracies, where you're unable to really exercise basic rights. Due process is ignored. And when questions are asked, the very vague answers are given. But I think there are a lot of lessons to draw for all countries that dabble in internet shutdowns from what recently happened in Bangladesh. So it's something I wrote about just last week on what we can learn from what happened in Bangladesh. And I think for me, the biggest lesson for any state that tries to shut down the internet is that Bangladesh turned off the internet. Could that stop the protesters from protesting? Could it stop them from toppling an entire government? And could that stop information from coming out? No, it could not. So it really shows how shutdowns really fail in the purpose that they're pretending to have. But also what it shows us is that when you shut down the internet, it can further frustrate a population to the extent that despite you being extremely violent towards protesters, people will continue to protest until you're toppled. So I think that's a huge lesson for authoritarian regimes around the world. Look at Bangladesh, look at how the shutdowns fail to quell protests, and learn that shutdowns will not be effective. And at the end of the day, it's political solutions and political processes and democratic processes that triumph, and that need to be addressed, rather than an ostrich approach where you try to bury your head in the sand and pretend like, oh, because we've turned off the internet or the network, nothing's gonna go wrong. So for me, that's the key takeaway from what we've seen, and we're also hoping that other governments will learn from this. But other than that, I think the impact of shutdowns on election integrity is very, very grave. Because there's a certain time in which you need that evidence to come out. There's a certain time period in which you need people to come out and vote. So there are a lot of missed opportunities because of such a shutdown. So I think there needs to be a lot more mobilization around that. And I'm also, this is something, during this week in Taipei when there have been so many events and so much brainstorming, what came to mind was that we have a lot of laws coming from the state saying, don't do this, don't do that. They're very negative in their approach. But I think we need to move towards like more positive enforcement of digital rights. So we need to, as civil society, we need to be advocating for laws that say you cannot shut down the internet, or you cannot be violating this right to connection, or this is how you're supposed to deal with different scenarios and situations. Because what we're also seeing is that there's an utter lack of understanding of how the internet works when it comes to the policymakers in this day and age. And I think civil society needs to take a stronger position in pushing better regulation. Thank you.
Thank you, Usama, for showing such on-ground news and the lessons from these two countries. And yes, I mean, I completely agree with the internet shutdown being a rough-edged sword and not actually stifling dissent, but leading to more aggression and at times more misinformation, because there is no method for anyone to verify that news and come up with evidences. And now I come to the front runner of internet shutdowns, which I have intentionally kept at last because I think would require a lot of inputs. So I'm leading to Mr. Gyan, and we have in India, because I come from the same region, I can also say that we have faced a lot of internet shutdowns, which have lasted over 200 days, even in the past year, with the protests in Manipur, and then during the farmers' protests, there was a long internet shutdown and rampant content blocking of any activists speaking on this. So when we are talking about internet shutdowns and content blocking, which is going on such a large scale, can you share the legal challenges faced by individuals as well as the organizations fighting against digital censorship in India?
Thank you, Haroon, for organizing this and related to be here. The legal challenges faced by organizations fighting against digital censorship are so many, but I limit my submissions on transparency. First, we have the legislature, which is throwing vague and overbroad laws at us. There are laws, legislations that have been made under that with vague and ambiguous provisions that can be interpreted by the executive and its branches in any way possible. There's also a lack of transparency and a confidentiality mandate. The information on internet shutdowns and on the content blocking orders that's passed by the executive is not maintained by them. There have been right to information appeals, applications, and also parliamentary questions asking the government, demanding answers on how many internet shutdowns have you and the various states promulgated. They say, we do not maintain this data. We've asked them, how many content blocking orders have you passed? They say, we do not maintain this data as we have to delete them in every 6 months. There is no transparency, therefore no accountability. From the executive, we get internet shutdown blocking, and also, like John mentioned, executives of private companies are made criminally personally liable. X had its office raided, Twitter as it was called then, had its office raided in 2021, if I remember correctly, late 2021. From the judiciary, we have judicial overreach and also limited recourses. So there have been instances where the judiciary has ordered content blocking because of frivolous issues of IP rights. And then because these internet shutdown orders and blocking orders are not made available, principles of natural justice are violated. There's no audio alterum partem. You cannot approach a judicial forum to get this order quashed, or you cannot even challenge because you don't know on what basis it is. In 2022, India saw Indian government pass 3 farm laws that aim to do so many, but inter alia, it wanted to privatize farmer bazaars or mandis as we call them. And also so the farmers naturally came out on the roads. They wanted all of this to be done away, because putting that in private hands puts the farmers in peril. Farmers in India do not earn a lot. So if you privatize them and there's a high chance of the market being monopolized, then their rights are violated. So there were huge protests. The government issued internet shutdown orders in the national capital region, that's Delhi, and the 3 bordering states, Punjab, Haryana, and Uttar Pradesh. Then there were also mass content takedowns, where not only posts but also wholesale accounts of activists, farmer organizations, journalists were censored. People were picked up from the streets, stopped from protesting, not told why they have been arrested. X partially agreed with the content takedown orders, where they blocked some of the posts that were there. But on the wholesale blocking of accounts, they approached the Karnataka High Court, where they said that MeitY needs to first of all provide, MeitY is the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, that's the digital ministry in India. They need to provide this order to the people whose or accounts have to be blocked, because the blocking rules of 2009 provide that if you're able to identify the person against whom you're issuing this takedown order, then you have to tell them that your account is being blocked or we're taking this down and the reason why. So Twitter asked that a blocking order be provided to the people whose account will be blocked, and then a reasoning be made on why it should be blocked permanently and not only certain posts be taken down. Now a journalist, you would resume, would not only report on farmers' protests, but also other issues, other crucial public issues of public importance. So wholesale blocking of their account does not serve any good purpose. Unfortunately, as the matter was still pending before the Karnataka High Court, the ownership of the corporation changed, and the new owner did not wish to pursue the matter further. On August 2021, so like I said, the content blocking order is not provided. On August 21, that's just 2 days back, there has been a partial win at the Delhi High Court. So the open source messaging platform Briar was blocked by India with 58 other applications on charges of national security, saying that it's used by terrorists actually, and therefore it needs to be blocked in India. So Software Freedom Law Center, whom I'm representing as a volunteer here, we assisted the messaging application to file a legal challenge before the Delhi High Court. After extensive hearing, the Delhi High Court yesterday said that an order, even though a redacted one, needs to be furnished to them so that they know on why they've been blocked. Right. So the first ask was that they be unblocked. However, given the pausing or the strategic tactics by the government, we had to then say that, okay, just provide us the order so we know why you've been blocked. This is only the second instance where a blocking order has been provided to a company. Before this was to Mr. Tanul Thakur, who ran a satirical website called Dowry Calculator, where you could go. So dowry is a social malpractice in India, where citizens, where during a marriage, the bride's family gives gifts or monetary compensation to the groom's family. So he made this dowry calculator where, according to your qualifications and maybe the land your family has, etc., you can know your worth on how much dowry you can get. So it was a satirical website, and it said so right in the description. However, the government blocked it, and Mr. Tanul Thakur approached the Bombay High Court and challenged it. He was provided with a blocking order, however, also told not to make it public, given the confidentiality mandate of Rule 16 of the blocking orders. So TLDR, answer to your question, Haroon, there are so many challenges that we face, but the fight continues. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for providing a very good insight on the grim realities that we have. That is the threat and impact of these censoring tools. Now, before we proceed to the solution, I'd open the stage for a few questions that the audience might have for the panelists, and then we can move to the solutions, I guess.
Hi, I have a question. My name is Elizabeth Donkfort. I'm with the American Bar Association, and JJ, unsurprisingly, my question is for you. You mentioned this is an issue of, problems because you're being asked to do these unreasonable due diligence checks in a matter of hours. Is this not a matter, more of a question of resource allocation amongst the companies? Because when Google or any other platform is engaging in a merger and acquisition, you've got 14 lawyers in the copy room on each side, and due diligence is not a problem. How many content moderators do you have overseeing hate speech and doxing in the Asia region, and where are they located? Dublin?
So it's not just a question of resource. So we have 25,000 content moderators worldwide, and more through third parties that support us. And they work 24 hours a day, which means that when some of them go to sleep in Asia Pacific, then they, those in Americas can take over and onto Europe, etc. So the teams are multi-country, and you have a mix of people who are generalists and those of them that might be more specialists, for instance, in extremist content, as one example, or child safety. You have to be specially trained, etc., etc. So you've got that resource, but one, you've got enormous volumes anyway. There's millions of pieces of content there. So the machines can help, adding people can help, but you also have just generally, think about 4 hours. So you've got terrorism cases, you've got child safety cases, you've got etc. So you need to think about prioritizing. Now we're being told, okay, you need to prioritize scams as well and do them within 4 hours, etc. So which one are you going to do first? You can throw more people at it, but then importantly, you also have cases quite often where we see the requests come in and it looks to us like it might be going beyond the letter of the law. Or it's, and that's very common as well, it's missing a lot of information. A minimum, it could be missing a URL, or it's missing the legal basis for that request. So we need to go back to the government. And normally, that would mean that the timeline is paused. But a lot of governments say, no, timeline is not paused. You still have only 4 hours or 24 hours, depending on the local framework. And if you don't comply, then you're in contempt of court, or they'll threaten a block, etc. It doesn't happen just to us, it's happened to other platforms. So the point is that it's not just a resource, it's a way of, it's in the right case, it's fine, it's to try and encourage the platforms to put in more resources, and which is fair enough, right, on proper online safety, but in the wrong hands, it can be misused as a forcing function to effectively encourage overblocking. And that's been well researched. You can look at, the Berkman Center, for instance, has done a lot of research on that. That's the effect. They reckon it's about 50% of removal requests that are effectively trying to force overblocking by not providing the right information and incentivizing the digital platforms to do the wrong thing. And what I'm saying here is that what we're seeing is a gradual increase in the sort of regulatory requirements to make it more and more difficult for digital platforms to do the right thing.
Thank you.
I want to add something really quickly. Thank you, Elizabeth, for bringing that question up. Myself, a panelist, and thanks for asking the questions. I don't have much to add, but I want to bring some questions out. We've been talking about internet shutdown very extensively and some content blocking. To me personally, I come from Hong Kong, but now I live in Canada. I get to experience different kinds of democracy. Not everyone has democracy, first of all, so that's why they need a viable vehicles to advocate for what they need. There's time that people are unfortunate enough that they need to take things to the street, and internet is something that enables them to do it. And in my opinion, whether it's like blocking the internet or blocking the content, is to cut the flow of information, which is something that is essential for people to make informed decision. But to many of the other people who don't need to protest or fight for the right yet, because you're fortunate enough to have a somewhat functioning democracy, perhaps, it's still around. There are times when it's not necessary that a country has like over regulations that prompt content over blocking. Taking one example from Canada, is this Online News Act that prompt Meta to pull out from Canada, well, I move a country, hopefully to get free access to, have some freedom. And turns out it's like their power is so big, they don't want to pay the news outlet, and they pull it out. And as soon as news, as something I see still as information with information credibility and integrity, leave the online spaces, I mean, more specifically social media, alternative information proliferate more accurately, memes, misinformation, disinformation, and that just complicated the whole thing. So to me, content blocking does not necessarily require really complicated government regulation sometimes. And to a certain extent, government policies are the one that may be a viable way to allow public participation to govern corporate policies. Because I mean, those spaces right now are not unregulated. It's just governed by corporate policies. So sometimes is regulations that evil? Maybe not. It's maybe not. But I understand, like in Asia Pacific context, given my personal background as well, I understand that it's a really tricky way when we talk about government policies, because if you're talking about an authoritarian regime, we don't want that. So I have a really mixed feeling, and I really want to leave this panel because I was like, this is like something that I don't really have an answer. And that's why I think for everyone who's sitting here who may be experiencing some sort of repression or you observed it, it's time to think about like what exactly we want at this age where I think going back to my point is like information is the one that's really critical for democracy these days. What do we see as credible, and how governments or private companies sometimes taking advantage of their own role and their power, whether it's like a political power or economical power in the market, to influence consumers or people like us, everyday people like us. So yeah, I will end here.
Hi, my name's Anjum from Internet New Zealand. It's interesting because one of our major news media companies, Stuff, quite some years ago pulled off Facebook. They don't post any of their articles on Facebook and they've been surviving just fine. So, there are other models, but I wanted to explore a flip side to, because yes, totally agree that shutdowns are bad, but in terms of liabilities for media platforms, when you look at the Amnesty International report on the impact of Facebook in the Rohingya massacre, when you look at their report on Facebook's impact in the Tigray conflict, I was born in India, but I haven't been there for a long time, but when you look at the disinformation around COVID, the language that is used against the Muslim community, that we're cockroaches, that we spread COVID and we did it deliberately, the whole love jihad bullshit, everything else that is actually harming communities. Why should executives not be held responsible when so much of that stuff is causing death, right? So I think we need to shift out those two issues, because shutdowns and the inability to access information, the right to protest is one issue, but liability of corporates and company executives around the way that their algorithms spread harm and cause death, they should be held liable, and we should be thinking about the human rights around that legislation, but we shouldn't automatically say there should be no such legislation, that you should have a safe harbour when you know that the design of your platform is exacerbating harm.
Yeah, I'd just like to comment on that, and I think the two questions are also interlinked. So yes, we agree that government regulations can be very, very harmful, right? And as somebody who advocates against draconian regulations in my own country, wholeheartedly agree. But there's a vacuum that platforms are leaving, right? And to Elizabeth's questions, how many moderators do platforms have specifically for Asia? So you could have 25,000 in the world, but how many of them are working specifically on Asia? What we've seen is that local language moderators and moderators with local expertise are very few in number across platforms. And because of that, you have more disinformation, you have more issues of harassment, you have more harms happening on the internet in these regions. And you know, the examples of Myanmar and Ethiopia are in front of us. It begs the question that if platforms do not allocate sufficient resources, then the government will step in to fill in that gap and bring in regulations. So what we do in our advocacy is we tell governments to look at community standards of different platforms and say, hey, these community standards do take care of a lot of what you're trying to do. But when those community standards are not equitably enforced in the global south versus the global north, that's where the issue with platforms come, and that's where the capacity for governments to come in with regulation comes in, right? So I think the allocation of resources is critical, and the allocation of resources is not just numbers, but the kind of moderators you have, what language skills they have, and what local context they understand. And I think that's when a self-regulatory model can be effective and something that civil society can then also advocate for along with companies.
Thanks. I would like maybe to ask a clarification question. I am from Canada as well, and often when we're debating laws to like take down some kind of content, the argument is, well, you're gonna help authoritarian regime like increase censorship in their own countries. I'm not sure if I understand, if from the past 5 minutes, if it's actually the case, and if good regulations could actually fill the void that we've been talking about and be a positive model instead of like a bad example that will empower authoritarian regimes. So like just clarifying this, are you against or pro the DSA, for instance?
That's a really cool question, and maybe that can link to, I don't want to go too quickly to the solutions bit, but I'd like to pick up on what Usama was saying earlier about what we might want to think of doing. And so the principles of the DSA are good, right? High level, you can debate the detail. The question is to have a comprehensive regulatory framework. So I mentioned, and I'm not going to say which country, but I mentioned a democratic country in this region, so as far as I know, always been democratic, where recently the regulator tried to take action against X. You can debate whether they were right or wrong. The problem is that the decision that they wanted to take would have impacted that particular piece of content outside the borders of that country, right? Which, by extension, would mean that other regulators, if they did the same in another country with very different cultural mindsets and frameworks, etc., could mean that that content, that another country that we might be untrusting of in terms of the democratic regime might be able to censor other, the content that users in other countries see. So, but the big difference is that democratic country here has got a court system that is rooted in due process, at least arguably, and the court has, there was an appeal and the court has ruled against the regulator saying, no, you overstepped the due process. So we need to think about how to have a framework that is, so if you look at Europe, you've got the DSA, which is pretty good liberal principles, but there's also other checks and balances behind it, a whole body of human rights law in Europe that ensures that hopefully shouldn't go too far if someone is trying to misuse it. And so when we're trying to think, okay, are there laws that can be replicated elsewhere in the world, we need to think, okay, well, the DSA is not just the DSA, if you will. It comes as part of a broader set of rule of law principles that you may not have in other parts of the world. And yet, when I look here in Asia, and again, I'm not going to mention which countries, but you will recognize them. Actually, it's not just the countries on this panel, there's others, and it's in the media. The ministers, when proposing legislation, say, oh, yeah, we've taken inspiration from DSA, and we've taken inspiration from the UK Online Safety Act, And then you look at the regulation, it's like, yeah, some of the principles are there, but not all of them. And, they kind of tinker with it for their own volition. So just maybe, if I might just pivot onto kind of what we should think about, what are solutions. I really like Usama, you're saying, okay, well, not only can we propose kind of good online safety, good practice online safety regulation, but maybe there's also kind of proactive, positive of pieces of broader regulation that can actually be helpful. One point that's really important in the EU DSA, which was already in its precursor, the e-commerce directive, which was voted in 2002, there's a general principle prohibiting surveillance, right? The constant monitoring of what users are doing online. That's like section 6 or whatever. That's a great one, right? I'd love to see that in every legislation on online regulation around the world. So are there things like that we could promote proactively, positively together? I think that would be really something that would be worth exploring more.
Yeah, I think that is super important, but I think what's also important is that companies are not carrying out that surveillance, right? Or aiding governments. If you look at Project Nimbus, Google has a 1.1 billion contract along with Amazon with the government of Israel. And that is being actively used to enforce an entire genocide. But when you ask questions about that, they say, oh, it's just a military contract, right? So I think those military contracts that companies have also speak to how militaries are then, companies are aiding governments and militaries in carrying out surveillance, in carrying out facial recognition, and in carrying out actual killings, right? And it's unaccountable. So I think when it comes to surveillance, it's well and good to ask for, restrictions, but then even in European laws, for example, the European AI Act that's being passed currently has an exception for military use of surveillance, right? And for exception for use of AI for military purposes. So where do human rights come in then? So I think it's also important when we look at the UN guiding principles on business and human rights that we're looking at, okay, what's the state responsibility and what's the company responsibility? But what are companies that are registered or are manufacturing within your territories doing outside your territories? Because the human rights of all people across the world should matter, not just within your territories. So I think the impact of those company practices is something that we really need to look at.
I'll also like to take a stab at your question on whether there can be good regulations. My experience from India has been that law doesn't matter. I mean, it does matter, but the execution part is where you need to pay more attention. So in India, you have laws, like I was saying, overbroad laws, which are then interpreted by the executive and the law enforcement in any way possible. I'll take the example of search and seizure of electronic devices. So today, it has become like a toolkit in the hands of the law enforcement agency. Wherever they conduct a raid, the first thing they do is seize electronic devices of not just the organization, but also all employees, etc. And then, so we do have laws on how they need to be documented and there are nuanced things like they need to be kept in a Faraday bag so that it cannot be manipulated, and then the hash numbers are also you need to take note of, so you know whether the data has been manipulated with or not. What we see is that law enforcement just doesn't follow any of that, right? So the EU DSA, for example, has very nuanced points on how if you are conducting a search and seizure of an electronic device, then you need to check certain boxes that, okay, this is the reason why we're doing this is what we're doing, etc. In another, just like a couple of days back, I was asking a Taiwanese authority on how do you keep your law enforcement in balance, and they said that judicial oversight is the way to go. In India also, we have that. However, what we see is that law enforcement just gets blank warrant signed by judicial officers, and then whenever they have to conduct a search and seizure, they just fill in the blanks, right? So unfortunately, my experience has been that even good laws can be misused.
Before you go ahead with the question, I just, I'm really sorry. Yeah, before you go ahead with the question, I just say that this is would be the last question we'll be taking, and then we'll be moving forward to the solutions, because I think that's what we are here for.
Thank you. And in fact, my question, I think, is in a way would be leading to some of the solutions also once the panelists answer that. So we discussed about DSA, and there were some important points made in terms of how that seems to be a more progressive and a promising legislation in content governance space. Another aspect of DSA, and I think that can be learned by the other jurisdictions, especially the APAC jurisdictions, and also be used in the advocacy, is how beautifully the DSA law has been able to segregate responsibilities from the liabilities. While there is content-related liability and that might be impacting your safe harbor, everything is not made contingent to your safe harbor protection. Like, procedural safeguards and procedural responsibilities are separate from your content-related liability. And this is something that many of the jurisdictions have not been able to do properly, especially as we see in the Indian IT rules, and there were similar replicas by other South Asian countries as well. A mix of like merging your responsibilities and liabilities together and linking everything together with your safe harbor protection is not the best way. And there, in fact, a thing that we need to make the government also understand is that, in fact, if you have the segregation in place, that helps you also enforce the law better. Because everything being linked to safe harbor and going to the judiciary might, in fact, delay the process. Because in a way, when there is a challenge related to safe harbor, the ultimate decision has to be by the court, whether the safe harbor is going to be taken away or whether the platform is going to be liable. If the liability and responsibility is separate and there are, say, fines that the executive might impose for procedural failures to comply with some responsibilities, like publication of your compliance reports, like having a nodal officer in place, that can be a swifter process rather than everything being a question of safe harbor and have to be adjudicated in the court. So just a thought that I've been dwelling upon, and happy to hear the panelists in terms of what they think about this. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of existing or upcoming reports from the dialogue on these issues, so I look forward to reading the detail. I think that there is something in there, right? It doesn't. We don't have. It doesn't have to be all about safe harbor. The question is how you kind of dissociate the wrong incentives and have the right ones in place. So some of the considerations that's up for further thinking. I think anywhere in the world, right? It's how do you judge the overall way in which a platform deals with things, rather than automatically focus on the one particular piece of content. So that might be one way of looking at it, which I think the DSA is kind of trying to get to by making sure that effectively the platforms have got a program in place. And the UK OSA is going in that direction as well. So it's trying to say, are you basically putting in place, to the largest extent possible, the right processes, people, technologies, etc., to look after users' safety? Not, are you doing the right thing on every single occasion? Because every single occasion gives the hook for maybe sometimes an abuse on that one angle. So anyway, I'm not saying I've got a full answer, but there's definitely something interesting to dig deeper on that one.
All right. So before we begin with the solutions, this is a quote which the chief technologist in our organization speaks a lot, and he says that technology is neither bad nor good, and not even neutral, and it all depends on how someone uses it and in whose hands the technology is. So moving forward with the solutions and a talk on solutions, Jenna, I was going to ask you first, but then I heard that you want to build on things, so I'd ask Sean first. So Sean, when we come to such topics on solutions and Google being a global company dealing with multiple jurisdictions, multiple laws, how have, obviously it's not in such jurisdictions that you're working with the government, but working with the CSOs as well. So how do tech companies like Google collaborate with civil societies to mitigate the impact of these these censoring tools, especially in the democratic processes such as elections? What's your thought on that?
That's broad. Sorry. That's broad. I could go on. Let me try and categorize a little bit. Just think about how we, what sort of actions can be taken by stakeholders as a whole, including industry, right? And you've got an important element which is about data gathering and transparency, right? So we've been publishing transparency reports since about 2008, 2009. And you can find them. We've got several types of them, quarterly, etc. And recently, you've had regulators saying, "Oh, well, you need to publish what you do," right? And they've mandated the publication of transparency reports. But actually, one of the reasons transparency reports came up in the first place was to document the types of requests that were being made, including those that might be going too far. So that's actually something important, so that then that data can be researched and can be used to evidence where there might be abuse. So we share a lot of that data, not just in our transparency reports, but also with some research projects like the Lumen database. And importantly then, the question is, once you've documented some of that, and I'm not saying just industry should do that, right? So CSOs are doing it, I mean, you guys are doing lots. You've got the role of speaking out, basically. And I mean, Usama, I think you're a member of the Global Network Initiative. That's just one example, right? Which happens to be a multi-stakeholder setting, since there's human rights NGOs on it and industry participants. And it was founded around the same time we started our transparency reports. And the idea here is both to sort of collect what's happening, but then to speak out. And I think that's an important thing to think about when we think about solutions. I mean, it's definitely not a silver bullet, but putting some pressure, showing what's happening, having a bit of international scrutiny of what's happening in a particular country can help. Especially when you have some countries in this region, for instance, who are really out there trying to cultivate foreign investment into their economies. To have the spotlight shown on them for doing the wrong thing by groupings such as GNI can actually have an effect, and certainly it should be part of a panoply. Not going to solve everything, but I think it's useful, and we could definitely do more of that. We know that there are regulations being prepared at the moment that could be worrisome in both of your countries, for instance. I know, you both share information, you raise the flag, but I think it'd be great if, we have an assembled community here. Maybe if you are interested, sort of, maybe the NGOs around here and industry will continue to share information with you, and there can be more sharing, more highlighting, more lights being shown on what's happening in those countries. If you start having articles in the international press that point the finger at some of those risks, I think it does a huge lot to improve things. So that's kind of, research, awareness raising, and sort of transparency in the sense of shining a light on the bad practices, and putting a bit of pressure through sort of soft power, if you want to call it that. And then there could be a regulatory-ish route. Very difficult to use international human rights law and enforce it, right? I mean, how are you going to make sure that countries respect international human rights law, especially when it can be disputed? And I guess the enforcement mechanisms are unclear. That might be the nicest word to use it. But so there might be some things there, might be worth exploring. But really, I think it's something around what you were talking about earlier, some sort of sharing of good practice, when there is good practice regulation, with the right checks and balances inbuilt, and then perhaps exploring more of those. Okay, is there something positive we can promote? We've got things like the Manila Principles that RightsCon put together, but can we be a bit more proactive on that? I don't know, have a bit more of a campaign approach to this. I don't have all the answers, but I'm just thinking about the categories of actions we can take. And certainly, I'm not saying it's just CSOs. On the contrary, it should be all of us as a civil society community, industry, tech community as well.
Well, just to add on that very quickly, I understand a panel has a really strong presence if speakers from countries has from repressive regimes in control, but then I don't want to discount that there's many people out there also living in democracy that is less repressive, and because there's many countries also facing an uprising of authoritarianisms in their countries, even in the West, I just want to, well, as someone who lost a democracy, a democratic rights somehow, I just want to put it out there as like we need to be cautious of what democracy means to you, and somehow I feel like we need to take a step back and not to demonize regulations or government policy too much, because I do believe modernizing existing regulations or legislation, for examples, and also having some sort of government policy in place can make sure, for example, private sectors to be accountable with whatever things John just suggested and actually do. So I think that's where government policy at play. That's what I want to add here.
Yeah, I think just thinking about, sorry, Haroon, do you have specific questions for us, or do we just answer?
No, please, just go ahead with the solutions, I'd say.
Okay.
Let's unpanel this panel.
Yeah, I think when it comes to regulations, at the end of the day, what's important is what principles are they made under, right? And I think that's why principles such as the Manila Principles on Intermediary Liability, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the GNI Principles on Platform Accountability are very, very important. Because what they do is they give you a guideline of like, okay, go ahead, regulate, but keep in mind these principles, right? Keep in mind necessity, proportionality, legality, and also similar other human rights responsibilities that states have. And I think the good thing with international human rights law is that all governments have signed the ICCPR, or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example, right? So using those procedures is also quite effective in many ways, because at the UN, whenever you have a universal periodic review, you can make submissions and say, okay, here are the violations. But I think the language of principles is something that we need to be pushing forward, and then holding governments accountable. And what we're also seeing is that with social media, you have the issues of disinformation. So for example, the riots in the UK that lasted around 3 days were all based on disinformation. And we're seeing that, governments are grappling with it. But I think, again, I would say that companies and platforms need to really be better at their self-regulatory models in enforcing their community standards in terms of use. Because at the end of the day, that is the quickest way to go about it. But companies need to take that a lot more seriously, maybe take it as seriously as they take their profits, and we'll have a better world.
Although I have a question to direct, I see a lady who has a question, so I'll let her speak up first. So please go ahead.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions, actually. Maybe one for Jean-Jacques when we talk about regulation, because I think one of the, as a global company, I think there's also the questions of how do you, as a company, approach situations when you have a presence versus when you don't have a presence, and as well when you have paid products versus just free products. I think with regards to Myanmar, there's been an argument we've had with Google over and over, where they keep telling us, we're not in Myanmar, right? And it's kind of cute, but really, you've been coming into the country for years. The government runs on Gmail in many ways. So there's clearly a global presence of a company like Google. And so this distinction between, being there versus not being there if your paid products are not in the market, I think is something that we also need to think about. And maybe for the broader panel, we talk a lot about, obviously, content governance and regulating content. We've talked about the DSA and regulating processes. But I think there's also this question of how do we regulate incentives? And in many ways, platforms are part of shaping the incentive structure. And they are taking incentives sometimes in the wrong direction. And I don't think there's been much effort at regulating that aspect as well.
Victoire, could you just clarify the second question?
Sorry, looking at whether there's been any attempt or any thought around regulation that focuses on incentive structures, and potentially looking at platforms' role in shaping those incentives.
I'll take the first one whilst we all think about the second. Thank you. So I think, you know, there are countries where we don't have a, you know, direct presence. We don't, you know, market proactively in the market. That doesn't mean that there are not people who are using our products, whether they're paid or not. And we will apply our thinking, our safety to those users just as any other users. And I do take into account what Usama has been saying, which is that, sure, we definitely do need to improve how we import our policies in the first place, how we develop them, new ones, and how we update the existing ones, and how we resource that. And we have made some improvements, and we'll continue to make some improvements. You made a very important point: languages and local dialects, for instance, right? I think someone touched on elections. Elections is a good one, or a good example, if you will, where we actually, you know, focus our efforts in particular around election time, going beyond just simple languages, but also, and not even just dialects, but even local slang, because then we have to understand, you know, what might be the latest slang word on the street to describe the opponents, the other political parties. So we need that local knowledge, and so that's the sort of things we've been working on, not just adding people, but trying to add expertise and training and all that to address that better and better. So much more work to do, always improvements, definitely conscious of that, and we're going to continue to do better and better, we hope.
I think engaging with governments is always tricky, and here I'd like to replug what I heard John say in another panel, that we need reforms not only for online laws, but also for offline. So there's only a limited role that technology companies can play when there are tumultuous times, right? So, I mean, it's a tricky question for sure.
Well, I would try the second questions, and I definitely have my own perceptions of incentive and how I interpret it as well. I think in terms of, because like our topic's about democracy, and I do think at the end of the day, we need to, I guess that's a question to everyone about how we do innovative policy intervention. Maybe we can also talk about it offline as well, because my opinion is really unpopular, and I don't want to put it out here before I did further research. But in fact, I do think that all stakeholders need to have more, you know, be more literate about public policies, and think about what actually serves better of your interests, of your own community, because otherwise we will be like complaining about certain stakeholders trying to govern certain things that might be more beneficial to one over the other, right? It's a paradox, and at this very moment, I do think we've been talking about, at least like I've been here, I have the privilege to be in this space talking about internet governance for like 6 years. We keep talking about, oh, private sector should do this, government should do that. Maybe perhaps it's time to experiment, taking another approach, which may be incentivizing certain stakeholders to be more accountable. But then I think that will become, that will go beyond policy discussion around internet governance or digital governance, but maybe it's end up about competition reform or policy around other things, because I think our online and offline world are being intertwined. And I will stop here because the rest of the things are the unpopular opinion of mine. Thank you.
Great. So I believe someone has a question, but I wanted to see how much time we have left on the panel.
We're actually over time. We're 3 minutes over time, Haroon.
Oh, we're 3 minutes over. So okay, then I'd bring in conclusion remarks if any of the panelists have, and then we'll end it. I don't want to take up anyone's time.
I think you can conclude.
Cool. So yeah, we better conclude. So yeah, thank you so much, everyone, the esteemed panelists, for joining this event at this talk, which I believe was a really important talk in the current time. And we have gained some really great insights from, I think, nearly all sections of the society except for the government. But we have I think we have their written I should censor myself anyway. Yeah, but so yeah, thank you so much for attending this, and I think we have received some really great insights and some really great knowledge. I think we can use the knowledge we gained here to move forward in each and every country, specifically in the Asia Pacific region. We have seen some great examples of what the people in the countries are doing. And with that, I think I would conclude. And once again, thank you so much, everyone, for being to join and being available in person.